The invisible tax, how inflation is engineered. Here's a number worth sitting with. The exchange rate for a singular American dollar in Germany in November of 1923 was 4 trillion marks. Bread that cost around 250 marks in early 1923 cost 200 billion marks by the end of that same year. People were paid twice a day because by the afternoon, the morning's wages had already lost a third of their value. Workers pushed wheelbarrows full of cash to the bakery, not as a political statement or metaphor, but because that was the only way to carry enough money to buy the loaf of bread. How did this happen? Decisions made in rooms by specific people in response to specific pressures. And once you understand what those decisions were, the number stops looking like chaos. It starts looking like a system doing exactly what it was built to do. This is the question we're going to sit with today. Is inflation something that simply happens to an economy? Could it be a random symptom? Or is it sometimes the result of a calculated choice made deliberately by people in power? Inflation, in the textbook sense, is a sustained rise in the general level of prices. That's it. Your coffee costs more, your rent costs more, your groceries cost more. Not because any one of those things became more valuable, but because the money you're paying with became less valuable. And here's the detail that doesn't get said out loud very often. Money losing value is not a bug. In small, steady doses, it's a deliberate design choice. Almost every major central bank in the world, the U.S. Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, targets an inflation rate of around 2% a year. They are not trying to keep your money's value stable. They are trying to make it lose value, on purpose, at a controlled, predictable pace. Why would anyone design it that way? The argument goes like this. A small, steady rate of inflation discourages people from sitting on cash and encourages them to spend or invest it, which keeps the economy moving. It also gives central banks more room to cut interest rates when the economy slows without falling into the negative territory. 2% is treated, in most of the developed world, as the sweet spot between an economy that's too cold and one that's overheating. A little inflation is not a side effect of the system. It is the system functioning as intended. The real question, therefore, becomes, what happens when that controlled 2% dial gets turned? Who turns it in? And what situation causes the shift of inflation rates? Inflation is controlled by two separate levers, run by two separate sets of people who don't always want the same thing. The first lever belongs to central banks. This lever is monetary policy. A central bank can raise or lower the interest rate based on the money they lend to other banks. Lower that interest rate, and borrowing gets cheaper across the entire economy. Mortgages, car loans, business credit. Cheaper borrowing tends to mean more spending. More spending tends to mean rising prices. Raise the rate, and the reverse happens. Borrowing gets more expensive, spending cools, and price increases slow down. Central banks also have a more direct tool, one most people only learned the name of after 2008: quantitative easing. In plain terms, the central bank creates new money. Yes, in a real sense, out of nothing, and uses it to buy government bonds or other assets. That pushes new money into the financial system on top of whatever interest rate moves are happening. The second lever belongs to governments. This is fiscal policy, taxing and spending. When a government spends more than it collects in taxes, it runs a deficit, and it has to borrow the difference, usually by selling bonds. Here is where the two levers start to tangle together. If a government's deficit gets large enough and persistent enough, somebody has to buy all that debt. Sometimes that's pension funds, foreign governments, ordinary investors. But when the appetite for that debt isn't there, or when a government simply doesn't want to deal with raising taxes or cutting spending, there is another buyer of last resort: the central bank itself. When the government leans on central banks in this way, economists interpret it as fiscal dominance. This is what occurs when a central bank stops setting policy based purely on what's good for prices and starts setting policy based on what the government's debt situation requires. The central bank doesn't announce this. It rarely says it out loud. But the bond purchases tell the story anyway. This matters because of one uncomfortable arithmetic fact. A government that owes money in its own currency can, in effect, make that debt smaller just by letting the value of the currency fall. If you owe $100 billion and inflation cuts the real value of a dollar in half, you've effectively cut your debt in half too. Nobody has to default. Nobody has to admit anything happened. The debt simply becomes easier to carry because the money used to measure it has been quietly devalued. This is the engine behind almost every deliberately engineered inflation in modern history. Inflation, used this way, is not a mistake. It's a repayment strategy. Let's go back to that wheelbarrow. Germany emerged from the First World War already deep in debt, having financed most of the war through borrowing rather than taxation. Then came the Treaty of Versailles, and with it, reparations, a bill owed to the Allied powers, payable in gold-backed currency that Germany simply didn't have enough of. The German government faced a genuinely brutal set of choices: raise taxes enormously in a population already exhausted by war, slash spending in a country trying to hold itself together politically, or do something else. Have the central bank, the Reichsbank, simply buy up the government's short-term debt and print the money to do it. They chose the third option, not once, but continuously for years. There's no solid evidence that German officials sat down and planned hyperinflation as a deliberate weapon against the Allies. Some foreign observers claimed that at the time that Germany was sabotaging its own currency out of spite, but historians have found no direct evidence of that. What the record does show is something quieter and, in a way, more disturbing. A government and a central bank that kept choosing the easy path over and over, each time telling themselves it was temporary, each time making the underlying problem worse. By 1922, the Reichsbank's president, a man named Rudolf Haberstein, held the sincere belief that his job was to print however much money the economy needed to keep transactions happening, even as prices spiraled. He saw the flood of new currency as a response to inflation, not a cause of it. He was wrong, and the country paid for that misunderstanding at a scale that's hard to comprehend even now. That's how by November 1923, a single US dollar was worth 4 trillion marks. The fix, when it finally came, is almost as instructive as the disaster. Hjalmar Schacht was brought in, and his very first act was simple. He ordered the Reichsbank to stop discounting government treasury bills. In other words, stop printing money to fund the deficit. That's it. That one decision, enforced strictly, broke the spiral within weeks. The hyperinflation didn't end because the economy mysteriously healed itself. It ended the moment one person had the authority to say no to the money printing and used it. Hyperinflation isn't a natural disaster. It's a policy sustained by a long chain of individually defensible-sounding decisions, and it stops the moment someone with the power to stop it actually does. It's tempting to file Weimar away as a one-time historical accident, a country pushed to a breaking point that no modern economy would ever reach again. It isn't. Argentina alone has lived through the same basic pattern, deficits financed by the central bank rather than by taxes, more than once across the past century, most recently hitting an annual inflation rate above 200% in 2023. The printing press, once it's been used to solve a budget problem, has a way of getting reached for again. Which brings us to a case that doesn't involve a collapsing economy at all. No hyperinflation, no wheelbarrows, no currency reform, just a strong institution, a determined president, and a phone. In 1971, the chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve was a man named Arthur Burns. He was, by reputation and by his own writing, an inflation hawk, someone who believed firmly that controlling prices was the central bank's core job. He was also a personal friend of President Richard Nixon, who appointed him to the job in 1970 and who was, by late 1971, beginning to think hard about his re-election campaign for 1972. We know what happened next in unusual detail because of the Nixon tapes, secret recordings made in the Oval Office, later released to historians and researchers. They capture, in Nixon's own voice, a sustained campaign of pressure on Burns to keep interest rates low and the money supply growing heading into the election. The tapes show Nixon discussing his influence on Burns directly with his aides. They show a White House that, according to multiple historical accounts, arranged for a damaging and fabricated story to be leaked to the press, suggesting Burns was hypocritically demanding a large pay raise for himself while pushing wage restraint on everyone else, specifically to pressure Burns into compliance. Burns' own diary, published decades later, describes a president who, in Burns' words, would do anything to be reelected. What we don't know with certainty, and this matters because the honest version of this story is messier than the conspiracy version, is exactly how much of Burns' actual monetary policy in 1971 and 1972 was the result of that pressure versus Burns' own economic judgment at the time. Some historians who've gone back through Burns' diary argue he had a more complicated, less monetary view of what was driving inflation in that period, and that painting him as simply caving to Nixon oversimplifies a man who also genuinely believed in wage and price controls as a tool. The pressure was real and well documented. Whether it was the decisive factor or one factor among several is something serious historians still argue about. What isn't in dispute is the data. In the year leading up to the November 1972 election, monetary policy was unusually loose. Interest rates low, money supply growing briskly. Nixon won that election in a landslide. And then, almost immediately after the votes were counted, policy reversed hard. Within about a year, the Fed's key interest rate had more than doubled. By Nixon's own account, in a recorded conversation in February of 1972, he told Burns, quote, "I really don't care what you do in April," meaning after the election was already decided. The inflation that had been quietly building through the election year didn't simply vanish once the votes were counted. It broke out into the open through the mid-1970s, compounded by a separate oil shock from OPEC, and the country spent most of that decade in a grinding combination of high inflation and weak growth that economists came to call stagflation. It took until the early 1980s, under a different Fed chairman, Paul Volcker, willing to push the interest rates above 15% and tolerate a brutal recession with unemployment over 10%, to finally break the cycle. This wasn't a fragile economy with a captured central bank and a long history of fiscal collapse. This was the United States, with an independent central bank designed specifically with legal protections to keep it insulated from exactly this kind of pressure. And it still happened, not through some dramatic seizure of power, through years of phone calls, dinners, a fabricated news story, and a president patiently working on a friendship and an institution he knew exactly how to lean on. The lesson isn't that central bank independence is fake. It's that independence is a design, not a guarantee. It works as well as the people inside it are willing to make it work, under pressure, when it's inconvenient. So if inflation can be deliberately encouraged, quietly, gradually, without anyone holding a press conference to announce it, the obvious next question is, encouraged for whose benefit? The honest answer is that inflation doesn't have a single winner. It redistributes. It takes value from some people and hands it to others, often without either side fully realizing it's happening. Start with debtors versus creditors, borrowers versus lenders. If you have a large fixed-rate debt, a mortgage, a long-term loan, inflation is quietly your friend. You agree to pay back a fixed number of dollars or euros. As those dollars or euros become worth less, your real burden shrinks, even though the number on the statement hasn't changed. Meanwhile, whoever lent you that money is on the losing end. They agreed to be paid back in a currency that's now worth less than what they handed over. Now scale that up to the largest borrower in almost every economy, The government itself. Governments are, almost by definition, major debtors. They issue enormous quantities of bonds to finance themselves. And the households, pension funds, and institutions who buy those bonds are, in effect, the government's creditors. When inflation rises faster than the interest rate on existing government debt, the real value of what the government owes shrinks. The government doesn't have to default. It doesn't have to raise taxes. Doesn't have to cut spending. The debt just quietly becomes lighter to carry, paid for by everyone holding the currency or the bonds losing value underneath them. Then there's the group on the losing end, people on fixed incomes and people who keep their wealth in cash or in low-yield savings. A retiree on a pension that doesn't fully adjust for rising prices. A worker without the bargaining power to negotiate a raise that keeps pace with inflation. Someone with money sitting in a basic savings account, watching the interest rate fall well short of the inflation rate, which means the real value of their savings is shrinking every single year, even as the number on the statement goes up. Inflation is regressive in its effects, in a way that a lot of people don't intuitively expect. Wealthy households tend to hold a larger share of their assets in things like real estate, stocks, and other investments that often rise in value alongside inflation or even faster. Lower and middle-income households tend to hold a much larger share of their financial position in cash, savings accounts, and fixed wages, exactly the things inflation erodes fastest, with the least protection. So when you ask who benefits, the most precise answer isn't a single villain. It's a structural tilt, debtors over creditors. Asset holders over cash holders, large indebted institutions, governments especially, over the ordinary households holding their currency and their bonds. Nobody has to conspire for this tilt to exist. It's baked into the mechanics of what inflation actually does to money over time. The conspiracy, if you want to call it that, isn't a secret meeting. It's an incentive that sits quietly in the structure, waiting for someone under enough pressure to use it. Everything so far has been about inflation as a choice. It's worth pausing on a counterexample. As of mid-2026, inflation is rising again on both sides of the Atlantic. In the United States, the annual inflation rate climbed to 4.2% in May, the highest reading since 2023. In the Eurozone, prices were up 3.2% over the same period, also the highest since 2023 and well above the European Central Bank's 2% target. In both cases, the driver isn't a deficit, and it isn't a central bank quietly monetizing debt. It's oil. A war between Iran and Israel, and the resulting disruption to shipping through the Straits of Hormuz. A war between Iran and Israel, and the resulting disruption to shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important oil choke points on the planet, has pushed energy prices sharply higher. In the United States, energy costs alone accounted for more than 60% of the entire monthly increase in consumer prices in May. In the Eurozone, energy prices were up nearly 11% over the year. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it cuts the other way from everything we've just covered. Nobody in Washington or Frankfurt sat down and decided to let prices rise this year. If anything, the opposite is happening. The European Central Bank raised interest rates in June, its first increase since 2023, specifically to keep this energy shock from spreading into the rest of the economy. The Federal Reserve has held its rate steady, watching closely rather than cutting it to juice growth the way a government chasing an election might want. So here's the honest caveat to everything in this episode. Not every inflationary period is due to a deliberate decision. Sometimes unpredictable things like a war. Not every inflationary period is due to a deliberate decision. Sometimes unpredictable things like a war. The skill worth having isn't assuming every price increase is a plot. It's being able to tell the difference, case by case, between the kind of inflation that's an accident arriving from outside the system and the kind that's a choice, made quietly, by someone who had another option and decided this was the easier one. So back to the original question. Is inflation a random symptom? Or is it a calculated choice? By now, the honest answer is that it's both, and the skill is in telling which one you're looking at. Weimar Germany's hyperinflation wasn't a single dramatic plot. It was a long series of individually defensible-sounding decisions made by a government and a central bank that kept reaching for the printing press because every other option looked harder, until a number like 4 trillion marks to the dollar stopped being a headline and became the only available description of reality. Argentina shows that this isn't even a one-time historical accident. The same basic temptation has reappeared across generations, under governments that agreed on almost nothing else. And the Nixon tapes show that you don't need a fragile economy or a captured institution for this to happen. You just need one person with enough patience, leaning on one friendship, inside an institution that was supposed to be immune to exactly that kind of pressure. That's the calculated choice side of the ledger. But the 2026 story is the other side, and it deserves equal weight, not a footnote. A war breaks out on the other side of the world. A shipping lane gets dangerous, and oil prices climb, whether any finance minister or central banker wants them to or not. Nobody sat in a room and decided this was useful. If anything, the people in the room are working against it, raising rates, trying to keep the shock contained rather than letting it spread. That's a random symptom, not a calculated choice, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty. So the real answer to the question this episode opened with isn't, it's always engineered, and it isn't, it's always an accident. It's that both things are true at different times, and the only way to tell them apart is to ask the same question every time. Who had a decision to make here? What did they choose? And who ends up holding the bill for it? That's where the structural tilt from earlier comes back in. Whether the trigger is a war or a deficit, the effect on ordinary people looks remarkably similar. Debtors do better than creditors. Asset holders do better than cash holders. Governments, the largest debtors of all, get to watch their obligations shrink in real terms without ever having to admit it happened. That tilt doesn't require anyone to conspire. It's just sitting there, in the architecture of money itself, waiting for whoever is under enough pressure or hit by enough bad luck to end up leaning on it. The invisible tax isn't invisible because it's hidden. It's invisible because almost nobody is required to explain it to you in plain language while it's happening, whether the cause is a war you can point to on a map or a choice made quietly behind a closed door. Sometimes it really is a random symptom, and sometimes, if you trace it back far enough, you find a room, a phone call, and a choice.